Okay, so this is a short ed puzzle on food webs and particularly marine food webs. It's going to focus on the factors that affect how much energy is available to be harvested by our marine birds and mammals for food, and especially the building on what we were talking about earlier in class with regard to climate and temperature and how those factors affect food availability for marine birds and mammals. And then we'll talk about some typical prey items for our species that we're going to be covering in this course. Okay, so productivity, what is that? What are we talking about? Typically, we're talking about the amount of energy that's being captured by photosynthetic organisms, amount of energy from the sun that's being captured by them and converted to organic material. So essentially, how much energy from the sun is being stored in a carbon-based molecule, typically some form of sugar, starch, etc., but also being converted to biomass. And in particular, net primary productivity, we're talking about the amount of energy that is left over in photosynthetic organisms that is left over after we deduct the cost of living, essentially, by those organisms themselves, right? So this is, again, energy that's stored in biomass. And in particular, when we talk about primary productivity, we're talking about energy stored in the biomass of photosynthetic organisms, which is usually plants. But when we talk about aquatic food webs, we're mostly talking about phytoplankton and microscopically small little photosynthetic organisms. We do have aquatic plants, but they're not nearly as common. So most of the organisms doing photosynthesis when we were talking about our aquatic food webs are tiny floating phytoplankton floating near the surface. So what are our limits to productivity? Well, photosynthesis requires a few things, right? It requires carbon dioxide. That's pretty plentiful everywhere, especially right now. So you have a lot of carbon dioxide dissolved in water. In particular, cold water holds more dissolved everything, nutrients, dissolved gases, than warmer water. So colder waters tend to be more productive in general than warmer water. You also need for photosynthesis, you need a source of water. That is the source of electrons for these photosynthetic organisms to replace the electrons, right, that are lost during the conversion of light energy to chemical energy in those photosystems, inside the chloroplast. And so you need water for that. And of course, you also need a source of energy. You need sunlight, right? So our primary productivity is limited by the availability of sunlight. It's limited by the availability of water, and of course, carbon dioxide. You'll notice the temperature is not on that list, right? Like I mentioned, cold waters tend to be more productive because cold water holds more dissolved gases and also more dissolved nutrients in general. Energy for photosynthesis, from photosynthesis, energy is not the only thing that photosynthetic organisms need. They also have molecules that they need to copy DNA and to make protein, and a lot of those building blocks are molecules that they cannot manufacture for themselves, and they need to get from their environment in some form or another. So they tend to be floating around in the water, around them, and of course more of that, it tends to be in areas where you have cold water that holds on to those nutrients, or where you have a lot of upwelling going on. So you'll notice the coastlines in this graphic here. Coastlines have higher primary productivity around our basically where we have major continental plates. We have more primary productivity in those areas compared to open ocean. And of course, the last limit, of course, is how far light can penetrate through the water. So it typically reaches not much further really than about 75 meters. So once you're below about 150 to 200 meters, there's not a whole lot of available light. And below that is pretty much the abyss, and it's just dark except for bioluminescent organisms. So you don't have a lot of light penetrating there. So most of your primary productivity is going to be in that surface, what we refer to as the photic zone of all of our aquatic food webs, whether this is a pond or a lake or the ocean. So it's the surface really is where all of that energy is being captured. So photosynthetic organisms need light, water, source of carbon dioxide to perform photosynthesis. And of course, they're going to take that energy from the sun and then convert it to chemical energy and then store it. And then, of course, use that energy. They're going to burn it basically the same way that we do through aerobic respiration and metabolic activity, and use that to basically live, right? Perform all of their functions in living. Some of that energy they don't need right now, so they're going to store it as starch or some other form. And also they're going to use that energy to grow and get bigger and then start dividing and essentially reproducing and making more of themselves. So both that stored energy and the energy that goes into reproducing other organisms, all of that is biomass, right? So there's all living things. So all the energy in those living things minus how much they use for themselves in the process of living is net primary productivity. And the reason we care about this, right, we're talking about the foundations of our food webs. The reason we care about this is because that's the energy that's available for other living things to harvest, right? Because our primary producers are photosynthetic organisms, which again in our aquatic food webs is usually phytoplankton. Those organisms can make their own food from sunlight. Other organisms, right, our marine birds and mammals in particular, right, have got to eat something else. So they have to consume organic material, break it down, and then reconfigure it for their own purposes and use that energy to build, their own bodies, and then of course also to reproduce. So basically store it in their own biomass, convert it to their own biomass. So in addition to the limiting factors we were talking about before, other limiting factors are the availability, as I mentioned, of those nutrients that our photosynthetic organisms need to copy their DNA, to make protein, and these are nutrients that they cannot manufacture for themselves. So for example, we can make a lot of our amino acids, but we have some amino acids that are known as essential. We have to have them, but we don't have the enzymes to manufacture them ourselves. And so we have to get them from the food that we eat. Well, these photosynthetic organisms have the same problem. I need to get organic nitrogen. I need to get organic phosphorus from the environment that I'm living in. So either produced by cyanobacteria, or I'm absorbing it from my environment as it's floating around in the water. Either way, I need to get the source of those limiting nutrients to be able to grow and divide. So the more nutrients you have available, the more primary productivity that generally will support. And of course, this helps explain why in areas where we see a lot of upwelling, we have cold, nutrient-rich water being drawn up to the surface, right? All those nutrients aren't doing anybody any good if they're just sitting at the bottom of the ocean. But if you bring them up to the surface where now they're within the reach of our phytoplankton who can use them to grow and divide, now you're not only recycling those nutrients, of course, but you're increasing your primary productivity. And so areas with a lot of upwelling tend to be very, very productive, assuming that they have sunlight, right? Don't think water is going to be a limiting factor in our aquatic ecosystems. And in general, neither is carbon dioxide, especially with climate change, and the ocean is absorbing more carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So that's generally not going to be a problem in terms of having that being available. But that limitation of nitrogen and phosphorus can be in certain areas. And so we get areas where we have a lot of upwelling tend to be very, very productive, and colder water ecosystems also tend to be more productive compared to warmer water ecosystems, mostly because those limiting nutrients essentially fall apart or break down because the molecules are vibrating, they're bumping into each other, and they start falling apart in warmer conditions compared to cold conditions. And so you have less dissolved nutrients in warmer water typically compared to colder water. unless, of course, you're in an area where you are, okay, the water's a little bit warmer, but because I have deep currents bumping into, let's say, an underwater mountain range that's deflecting that cold, nutrient-rich water up to the surface, now I've got a source of those nutrients, and we can expect those areas to exhibit a very high primary productivity. And so they tend to be what I kind of talk about as hotspots and very reliable food sources for marine birds and mammals. Later on, we're going to talk about there's a lot of seasonal changes in terms of where our marine birds and mammals go to find food, but some places are very reliable food sources, and those are generally places where there's a lot of upwelling, and upwelling that's consistent as a result of those deep water currents. So food webs are basically made up of various levels, and what we refer to as trophic levels. And so these are groups of species which we sort of lump together based on what they're eating, and refer to them as functional groups. And so up to this point, we've been talking about primary producers, mostly, again, photoautotrophs. So these are phytoplankton in terrestrial ecosystems. Quite often they're plants. But these are organisms that are converting sunlight into stored chemical energy, and that's the source of their food. So their food source is basically light from the sun plus carbon dioxide. They're making their own food, really. And so that's why we refer to them as primary. They're producing energy. So those are our primary producers. Everybody else, though, is going to be a heterotroph, right? They've got to consume organic material from another organism and then break it down and then recycle that biomass and harvest the energy stored in those chemical bonds, right? So primary producers, as I mentioned, that primary productivity is providing energy to support the rest of the food web, all the other layers, right? So organisms that mainly are feeding on primary producers, we refer to them as herbivores or primary consumers. And so there's, again, like I said, herbivores. So you can think about in terrestrial ecosystems, right? A cow would be an herbivore. They're eating primarily plant material, right? And then whatever kills and eats the cow, right? Maybe the, I don't know, mountain lion or something like that, would be a secondary consumer. So these are carnivores. Now these are, we've set them up here to be very sort of clear, mutually exclusive levels. Real life is not nearly this tidy. So as we're going to see, you're going to have food webs where organisms may feed at multiple levels, right? You may have an omnivore that eats both primary consumers, but also will feed on primary producers when the opportunity presents itself, right? Bears are good examples of, well, most bears are good examples of omnivores, right? They'll eat fish, but they will also eat, you know, berries and nuts and stuff like that, plant material. So they'll eat, they will forage at multiple trophic levels. But just for our purposes, we're just going to kind of keep it simple for now. So again, we have primary consumers, our herbivores, feeding on the primary producers, and then converting that energy to their own biomass. And then, of course, our secondary consumers are eating the primary consumers, and again, converting that to their own biomass. And then, of course, you'll notice all the arrows go to the detritivores because eventually everything dies, right? And you absolutely have to have organisms whose job it is to break down and recycle dead organic material. Otherwise, everything eventually ends up in the dead organic form, and there's no nitrogen and phosphorus, right? Everything gets tied up in dead organic material, and there's no nutrients available for other organisms to use. And so we have detritivores at various levels, right? Everything from bacteria to invertebrates, to other types of detritivores. I'm thinking of like hagfish and some of our deep sea sharks who feed on these, you know, giant whale carcasses and things like that. They're breaking it down into smaller pieces and eventually breaking it down to its, you know, building block components. And that's in the water, but it's also in the sediment. And that is what is getting pulled up towards the surface when we have upwelling. And eventually you have recycling of that detritus into those organic building blocks, and that's, of course, essentially those nutrients, those limiting nutrients for our primary producers. So the energy at the lower levels of a food chain helps support populations at the upper levels, right? And so again, we consider a food chain as the transfer of energy between different trophic levels. I've used the words food chain and food web interchangeable, but really a chain is a more linear arrangement. Food webs are a little bit more realistic. As I was mentioning, a lot of organisms will forage at multiple trophic levels. And so really a food web is much more realistic in terms of modeling what real life looks like. But in any event, you've got energy at the bottom of the bottom trophic levels, particularly our primary producers. Again, this is the energy that is used by the rest of the food web because it's the only place where you have energy entering the ecosystem from the sun. So that energy, that net primary productivity, is the energy that's available for the rest of the food chain to use. And the problem is that the conversion of energy between trophic levels is extremely inefficient. Something about, I think, 10% of the biomass from one level actually makes it to the next level. So that's extremely inefficient transfer. Part of that, of course, is explained by the inefficiency of the process of breaking down organic material and harvesting the energy in those bonds, right? Every time you transfer energy from one form to another, you lose some as heat, right? The entropy, a residual energy loss. So that's partially responsible for it. And then you also have differences in the efficiency of the particular taxonomic group in harvesting energy. So invertebrates tend to be fairly efficient. Fish are pretty efficient, but a lot of other vertebrates are using up a lot of the energy that they consume to maintain their own body heat, rather than, like mammals and birds, rather than converting that energy to their own biomass in terms of stored energy and or reproduction. So that efficiency is, like I said, the energy transfer between trophic levels is extremely inefficient. And so what this generally means is most food webs, the maximum I think I've ever seen is 6, and most it's 5 at most. So that would be a very productive ecosystem would be able to support a food chain that has 5 links to it because of the inefficiency of that energy transfer. So yes, only about 10% of the energy in the biomass at one particular level makes it to the next trophic level, right? So what this effectively means is about 10 kilograms of herbivore can support only 1 kilogram of carnivore biomass, right? And if you have, secondary or tertiary carnivores, then it's going to be even less than that, of course. So this, again, when we're talking about biomass, we're not talking about, again, combined mass of all the individuals in that trophic level, right? So you would harvest all the phytoplankton, and it's usually measured by dry weight. So you take the water out, and what you have left behind is the biomass, right? That's energy stored in organic material, again, through growth or reproduction. And everything in that particular trophic level, right? So the next trophic level up, if we're looking at an aquatic food web, is typically zooplankton. So these are really tiny animals that are feeding on the phytoplankton. Krill also would count as zooplankton when we look at typical diet elements for our marine birds and mammals later on. So they're feeding directly on the primary producers. And so, of course, the idea there is the more primary productivity you have, right, the larger the populations of the phytoplankton, right, that's more biomass, you can support larger populations of zooplankton. And larger populations of zooplankton can support larger populations of fish, right, or whoever else is feeding on the zooplankton. It could very well be, baleen whales. But the more biomass you have at those lower trophic levels, the larger the populations that you can support at the higher trophic levels. Okay, so far we've been talking about how lower levels impact higher levels in terms of affecting the population size and energy flow. So these would be bottom-up trophic dynamics, right? The idea that changes in the biomass at lower trophic levels affect biomass at higher trophic levels, right? So if I have higher primary productivity, I have larger populations of primary producers, that means I have more energy and biomass available for use by those higher trophic levels, and I would expect to see larger populations of primary and secondary consumers based on the increase in biomass at the lower trophic levels. That's very, very logical. Makes perfect sense in terms of how we think that food webs work. But we also have top-down dynamics. So this is the idea that the populations at higher trophic levels can limit the abundance or population sizes of lower trophic levels. This is what's known as a trophic cascade. And this tends to, you get a situation where you're actually skipping a level. So let me just back up a second and explain this. So and this again is logical and makes sense. If I have a lot of predators, right, that's a lot of organisms that are feeding on the next lower trophic levels, let's say the herbivores, we're going to expect that herbivore population to go down, right? It's going to decrease because everybody's getting eaten, right? This means that the level below the herbivores, right, the primary producers will actually see an increase in their population because fewer, assuming that all else being equal, fewer of them are getting consumed by herbivores because the herbivores are getting consumed by the carnivores, right? And this is I always think of this as a cascade. It's sort of like a slinky going down the stairs, and it kind of skips every other level. And so this, in reality, both of these things are happening at the same time, right? So if I get an increase in nutrient input because of upwelling, right, that's going to give me more primary productivity. I'm going to have bigger populations of primary producers. That means I have larger populations of primary consumers. I can support larger populations of secondary consumers. However, if I have a lot of primary consumers, the word might get out of, hey, there's a lot of food over here. And suddenly I have secondary consumer populations are increasing because organisms are coming in from other areas to feed on those primary consumers. Primary consumer population then drops as a result of a top-down trophic interaction. And that means that my primary producer levels then go back up. So these flux in population sizes in response to increases both below and above constitute really our trophic interactions. We have two types, but like I said, in real life, they're often both happening at the same time, and it just helps us as ecologists to look at them separately just so we can sort of parse some things out. And so we're going to see quite a few examples of top-down interactions when we look at different populations of marine mammals. For example, sea otters are a keystone species. And so they, by their feeding on primary consumers, which is a lot of invertebrates that eat kelp, it's particularly urchins, but other types of invertebrates as well that are grazing on the kelp, basically herbivores. By our otters limiting those herbivore populations, it allows the kelp forest to grow and be abundant. And the kelp forest is actually provides a physical structure. It provides habitat, which also increases the diversity in the community. So sea otters have a tremendous impact on the diversity in the communities in which they live by virtue of the fact that they are acting as in their role as a predator. They're acting as a disturbance, and they're creating a trophic cascade by how they're interacting with their prey items. Okay, so here's a kind of typical example of an aquatic food web. As you can see, we have some interactions that are nice and linear, but many of them are, again, this is why we call it a web, not a chain. Many of them are foraging at multiple trophic levels. What we typically do when we're counting trophic levels in a food web is we default to the higher level. So, for example, let me take a look at one of our species here, right? So let's just start counting. So I have my phytoplankton, right? That's my primary producers. That's nice and easy, right? There are organisms that are doing photosynthesis that's bringing energy into the food web, and they're serving as the foundation for that. We only have two groups that are feeding on the phytoplankton. Those are krill, which are, again, sort of in our broader zooplankton group. Primary consumers, and of course also our other types of zooplankton, the copepods. Okay, now here's where it gets a little bit tricky, possibly. All right, I've got some secondary consumer, carnivorous plankton, which are, again, zooplankton, but they're zooplankton that are eating other zooplankton instead of eating phytoplankton. So they would be on, they would be secondary consumers, right? You have the birds that are feeding on the krill. They're also feeding on the herbivorous plankton, and they're also feeding on the carnivorous plankton. So I don't know. I'd put the birds somewhere between a secondary consumer and possibly a tertiary consumer, depending on which pathway the energy goes, right? Because they may be the fourth level, they may be the third level. Baleen whales are nice and easy as secondary consumers. They're feeding almost exclusively on krill. This is an Antarctic food web, as you can tell, because we've got penguins in there, something we don't find in the Arctic. But they're feeding directly on the krill, and which of course are feeding directly on the phytoplankton. So that's a nice, easy example of a secondary consumer. Likewise, crab eater seals, which ironically do not eat crab. I know, it's weird, but they eat not exclusively krill, but it's a very, very large portion of their diet. So this works out pretty well for them. But here's where it starts to get a little bit tricky. So now I've got, again, fish are another good example of a secondary consumer. So are the squid, although you could make the argument that the squid may also be tertiary consumers if you follow the arrows from the phytoplankton to the copepods to the carnivorous plankton to the squid, right? That's 4 levels and not 3. So depending on which pathway you follow, right? Leopard seals could be tertiary consumers, or they could be considered quaternary consumers. Elephant seals also likewise tertiary consumers, following the arrows for the most part there, as are the sperm whales, are also tertiary consumers. And then we actually do have quaternary consumers in this particular food web, and that's the smaller toothed whales. Basically, these are dolphins and killer whales. They're at the top. Killer whales pretty much are the only things that are going to be feeding on leopard seals. Leopard seals are among the dominant predators in our Antarctic food web in terms of consuming other seals, as well as penguins and fish and squid. Leopard seals do eat also krill, as I mentioned, also other seals. So they are really foraging at multiple trophic levels, but the highest level then would be they would be tertiary consumers. At the, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah. Again, you could make the argument that they may be quaternary consumers there as well. And then you have at least a quaternary consumer in the orca, the small toothed whales, and again possibly higher depending on which pathway you're following. And then of course humans are definitely quaternary consumers because we are feeding on largely tertiary consumers, but also on some secondary consumers as well. So we tend to default to the higher trophic level to account for those multiple interactions when we're counting trophic levels. So we've talked about the effect of nutrient availability on primary productivity and the effect that that has on higher trophic levels in a bottom-up trophic interaction. And we've talked about how upwelling brings, whether it's driven by strong offshore winds or deep currents colliding with underwater mountain ranges or continental plates and deflecting water upwards. Either way, you're bringing cold, nutrient-rich water up to the surface, and you're providing a source of those nutrients. So in our previous lecture on climate, we talked about convective currents, and we also talked about the Coriolis effect, right? The fact that, as I mentioned, those two ways of generating upwelling are both derived from the Coriolis effect, the fact that we are spinning like a top in space, the planet Earth spinning, and as it's spinning, it's carrying the air and the water masses that are sitting on its surface with it as it's rotating. And so this of course means, as we talked about earlier, and I'm not going to get into the mechanics of it, but you end up with a clockwise deflection of air and water currents in the northern hemisphere and counterclockwise in the southern hemisphere. And that means that you have currents that may be hitting continental plates, deep currents hitting continental plates or surface currents even at an angle. And when they do that, right, they have limited options in terms of where to go. Some of that water is going to be deflected up towards the surface, and that helps create upwelling in some of those areas. It also means that our prevailing wind directions are east to west, both north and south, immediately north and south of the equator. Those are our trade winds, and they have blowing very, again, strong winds blowing in a very consistent direction from east to west. And then, of course, because of the deflection, we have our westerlies at the higher latitudes blowing from the west to the east, which of course is why we call them the westerly winds, right? And so again, you can get upwelling generated from deep currents being deflected upwards, but you can also have upwelling generated by strong offshore winds. So this is wind blowing from a landmass towards the water, and if it's strong enough, it can actually push surface water away from the shore, and that creates basically suction and pulls up cold, nutrient-rich water from the bottom. This is all fine and dandy, right, as long as that strong wind is blowing. So we get seasonal upwelling at the coast of California in the spring and summer because we get strong north winds that create our offshore winds and create extra upwelling for us. So we get a little boost of primary productivity. Off the coast of South America, during an El Nino event, and we're going to go into this a lot more later on when we talk about the effects of El Nino, particularly on our marine birds. It really has a big negative impact on them. But in an El Nino event, what happens is and this is again as a cyclical weather event, happens about every 7 years, but it varies a little bit. And what happens is the wind still blows in the same direction, but it's not nearly as strong. The air pressure drops. And so what this means is that the surface water that's normally pushed away from the west coast of South America, basically this drawing looks like it's flowing backwards. It just essentially stays put. It doesn't get pushed away. It stays put. And this means that you do not have a lot of nutrients being drawn up from the bottom because your source of upwelling is largely gone. It's largely turned off. So I've got a couple of questions here for you that I will pose and then give you a chance to answer here in just a minute. First, of course, is what likely will happen to primary productivity in this environment during an El Nino event. And the second question is, how will this affect other trophic levels in a bottom-up interaction? Okay, so what do our marine birds and mammals eat? Right, we've been talking a lot about various trophic interactions and food webs. What is their food? So as we mentioned, our primary producers, right, these are the foundation of our aquatic food webs. This includes cyanobacteria, dinoflagellates, diatoms, different types of algae. These are generally not food sources for marine birds and mammals in the sense that they eat them directly, but again, they are providing the energy source for primary consumers like zooplankton and secondary and tertiary consumers like fish and marine birds and mammals and things like that. So like while they are not prey items directly, they are important components to food webs by providing energy sources for zooplankton. So zooplankton includes copepods, which are on the right-hand side picture there. That's what copepods look like under a microscope. So these are pretty small little animals, but they exist in large volumes, and so enough biomass to sustain a blue whale. Blue whales will feed, we talk about krill, but they actually eat a lot of copepods as well. Part of the zooplankton also includes small crustaceans, eggs of different, fish eggs and things like that. The larval fish as well are considered part of the zooplankton layer. So these are basically just little animals and eggs and things like that that are floating typically fairly close to the surface. And these are our prime food sources, again, for some of our largest marine mammals, but a lot of marine birds as well have zooplankton as a very large component of their diet. Zooplankton also includes krill. Krill are probably some of the largest members of what we consider zooplankton, which is basically floating animals, was what that kind of translates to. And here we have on the right is basically a swarm of krill. And if you have enough krill, their bodies turn sort of an orangish red from the food that they're eating, the phytoplankton that they're eating. And so the large swarms will essentially color the ocean red and orange. So it almost looks like there's blood in the water when in fact it's actually just these huge masses of krill that are coming together for mutual protection, but also for reproduction. They're essentially tiny shrimp. That's basically what they are. About 2 inches long, so decently sized among the larger members of zooplankton. All right, so zooplankton are providing food source for squid. They're typically feeding, again, towards the surface and then on zooplankton and any fish near the surface, but they will also dive down to the depths to forage on fish. And in deeper water, mostly squid are, and these squid in the picture are actually reproducing. The long white kind of blobs are egg sacs that have been fertilized, the females are laying. So this is basically a reproductive cornucopia that's going on right now, frenzy, so to speak. And so the squid will go down into deeper waters, one, to reproduce, but also to hide from their own predators, which is typically larger fish like sharks, but also dolphins. So again, squid are foraging on fish, but also on zooplankton, so they are foraging at multiple trophic levels. And then finally we have fish that are again feeding on both phytoplankton and zooplankton, which basically makes them a secondary consumer. Squid, of course, also being either secondary or tertiary consumers. Other members, other primary prey species that do not include fish are things like pelagic red crab, as well, which are crustaceans, but they're basically too big to be considered zooplankton. So they're somewhere along the squid line of things in terms of being a prey item. So different types of fish varying in size. So we have tiny fish like anchovies and sardines. Rockfish are kind of medium-sized. Capelin also kind of on the smaller end of things. And then you have larger fish like the herring here on the right-hand side, photograph. And again, things like things that we eat, right, like cod and salmon, also commonly taken as prey items. Some larger marine mammals, dolphins in particular, or orcas may go after tuna as well. But it's mainly these sort of small to medium-sized fish that become really large diet components for our marine birds and mammals. And so in the upcoming lecture, we'll be talking about predator-prey interactions and ways that prey can avoid becoming dinner. And you'll notice two things. One, we have schools of fish, so all these organisms are crowded together for mutual benefit. It's a numbers game, right? If there's lots of them, especially if they're moving relative to each other, it's really hard for a predator to grab one of them. So an individual's risk is diluted. We actually call this the dilution effect. Their risk is less if they're in a group than if they're off by themselves. So you don't want to be the fish that zigs when everybody else zags, right? And then you're off by yourself and you're the one that becomes the victim, right, of the predator that's cruising around. The other thing that you'll notice are the sort of silvery mirrored sides that reflect the light. You would think this would call attention to them, but it actually is a form of camouflage. It makes it the light reflections, which are all over the place all the time in the ocean because of the sunlight petering through the water, actually makes it difficult for predators to see the school as it's moving. So those silvery sides are actually helping to make it harder for the predator to focus on a particular individual, and in some cases to even see the school of fish as it's moving.